Hello, old timer here again with chapter number 3 of the story about the last barefoot generation. This is describing the times during the Great Depression on how country children grew up in the Southeastern Coastal Area. The exact area where I was born and grew up is about 10 miles inland from the ocean as the crow flies. Most of the land area is low and wet most of the year because it rains a lot. Actually though, it rains a lot in the winter months, and many times the summers are hot and pretty dry with just passing thunderstorms some days. It's not really a good area for farming, but the old people said that they couldn't eat trees, and all the land around there is heavily covered with trees, and they had to clear as much as possible to make gardens and fields and pasture areas, because getting food to eat was their single most important occupation. My dad and granddad had quite a bit of cleared land and grew a lot of corn as well as many garden crops most of the season. After the growing season in the fall, they would take a horse or mule and what they called a turn plow and turn the top 8 or 10 inches of dirt over so the grass and the roots would rot during the winter and help what they planted in the spring grow better. My grandpa on my dad's side had what they called marsh fields. The early settlers used slave labor to create dry fields out of marshland. They did that to grow rice because when the first English settlers came to that area, rice got to be a popular crop along with indigo, and they started working on the rice fields because they need to be able to flood them and so forth to grow rice. Plus it was actually a lot easier to do all the work and drain and digging canals and so forth to drain it than it was to clear all the big trees and the huge stumps after they cut the trees down that remained. What they would do, they'd have the workers start at an area where a creek flowed from a larger creek or river through the marsh. In a lot of places there was 1,000 feet, 2,000 feet of marsh between the actual creek or river and what they call the hill land, the higher elevation dry land, solid land or dirt. They start digging a canal about 8 or 10 feet wide from right there about anywhere from 10 to 15 feet on what was going to be the field side of the creek, and they dig that canal all the way out alongside of the creek to where the creek ran into the river, and then they turn their canal and run along the river. Usually they got further in towards where their field was going to be from rivers, because sometimes high water flood waters would come over, and all the dirt they were digging out of the canal they'd throw up as a dike between the creek, or when they got to the river, between the river and what was going to be their dry fields. Anyway, sometimes it took 3 or 4 years to do all the digging because some of the fields were really huge, and it took a lot of labor to dig a ditch or a canal 6 or 7 feet deep and anywhere from 8, 10, 12 feet wide, all that distance. That canal then in what became the fields, they'd have smaller canals that run across or whatever the field part to drain the land better into the canal. And those canals, what they would do is when they were digging it, they'd cut a ditch from their canal into the creek, and they'd put a big like a box, maybe 4 or 6 feet wide, a rectangle, and like a big pipe. They called it a trunk, and it was made out of cypress. They'd put that in at low water in their canal out into the low water mark of the creek, and they'd pile, dirt on top of it or mud on top of it, and then they put doors on the inside, what they call doors. It was like a big, well, like doors or windows, but solid wood that they could open in both ends and let the water drain out of their fields, or they could open both ends and let the creek water come into their fields when they wanted to flood them. Anyway, that was the way it worked, and that's the way they got the fields to begin to grow rice in that area. They usually grew the indigo in the higher area, the higher land. And my dad said that generations before him really was growing a lot of rice, and also a lot of indigo. And he said his dad told him that he had been told that whenever the indigo was being processed, it really smelled. It stank. It had a terrible odor while it was being dried or processed, and in order to make the dye or whatever they made out of it. When I was born and living there down along the main river, there were still some old piling that had been driven into the mud along the riverbank, and also there were big piles of black stones in the mud, and people said that was where the docks were before the war between the states, or what you call the Civil War, came along. It's where English sailing ships would come up the river there and load the rice and the indigo, and the big piles of black rocks was what they used for ballast when the ship was empty, to keep strong winds and whatever from blowing it over on its side. The rocks was a heavy weight they put down in the center of the bottom of the ship to make it harder for the wind to blow it over against the sails. Anyway, they said that the English sailors' uniforms were dyed blue from the indigo they got from there. During my time as a teenager there, we also had a lot of farming activity still going on in those old rice fields, as well as the garden areas and fields and pastures on the hill land. And there was a road from there was a paved road to run north and south. It was a national highway, and it wasn't too wide like roads are today. But anyway, it ran up and down, and our country road ran west off of that paved road, and all along every few miles there were other roads that run out to the west inland, away from the ocean. There were also roads that ran east in towards the ocean, and you could go, some of them you only could go a mile or two before you couldn't go any further, because I knew that if you went east toward where the sun came up, soon you'd get to where one creek ran into another one, and you couldn't go any further because you'd have to cross one of those creeks in order to go any further east. And some of them, of course, you could go 6 or 8, even 10 miles, and you'd come to the bigger waterway. And back then, people lived all down in there towards the ocean also. And I don't remember how old I was, but I remember asking my dad what was up our road that went west away from the ocean, and he told me that people say that you could ride for months in a horse and wagon going in a straight line as you could in the westerly direction, and it'd take you several months before you could finally come to a big ocean, and that'd be far as you could go. He said that there was a place called California out there that he had heard a lot about, and he also said that there somewhere out there was a place called Mexico also. That's how much he knew about what was really out to the west further. And speaking of west and north and so forth, I remember my dad taught me directions by making me stand one morning facing the rising sun, and he told me that was east, and if while standing facing the sun as it came up over the trees, if I held both of my hands out in straight lines from my side, my left hand would be pointing to north and my right hand was pointing towards south, and the direction right back of me was west. And he also told me that if I stood the same way facing east and the sun was back of my head, it was the time was in the afternoon, because when the sun was straight up over my head, it was near the middle of the day. And he also taught me that if I was in the deep woods, which there was a lot of it around there, and I got turned around and didn't know which way to go, that I needed to start looking on trees and try to get 2 or 3 together or 4, and when I could see some kind of moss growing on the same side of 2 or 3 trees, that probably meant that was north. And so if I could stand with the left hand pointing north, then my face would be pointing east and back of it would be west, so forth, and I could kind of get my directions on where I need to go to get back out from where I was, anyway, from being lost. And he also told me that it was very important that I remember that, because knowing where you were going and not getting lost, or what they call turned around, was a very important thing for a young man to know. Later, I found out when I went in the military, I found out that some of the grown men in my outfit didn't know how to tell east from west, especially the city kids. And down our dirt road, it ran into that highway, and a mile or 2 to the south, to the next road, there was a small Standard Oil gas station, and there was very little traffic on that paved road back when I was real young, but as I got to be a teenager, there got to be a lot more. But mostly the traffic was in the fall or in the early spring months, and I learned that it was tourist cars from New York or New Jersey would come down that highway going to Miami or Miami Beach, way down in Florida. I didn't really know where that was. Tell you something that happened about the time we heard about the U.S. going to war against Japan. We lived in in that rural area down a little dirt road away from the paved road. But one day I was in our, what we call our front garden, the one nearest to the dirt road, gathering, picking tomatoes for my mom, when a car on the dirt road stopped and honked the horn loud 2 or 3 times, and a funny dressed man with black hair got out and started hollering at me. I put down the basket of tomatoes and walked over to the fence. By the time I got there, he was just across the fence from me. He walked over across the ditch to the fence where I was coming up to, and he was talking some kind of funny talk that I couldn't understand. Anyway, I finally understood that he was asking me which way was Charleston. I hadn't really heard of Charleston, but I thought it was to the north, so I pointed in the direction for him to go down the dirt road to the east and then go my left hand towards the north. And then he started asking me where was Jacksonville, and I told him I was pretty sure Jacksonville was down my right hand down the paved road and towards the south. And he kept on wanting to ask me what I was doing with my arms and so forth, and I told him I was trying to show him which direction. And then he said, "Boy, there ain't much between you and an idiot, is there?" And without thinking, and I don't to this day know where my answer came from, but I said, "No, sir." Back in those days, all country kids were taught to say no, sir, and yes, sir to their or yes, ma'am, and no, ma'am to older people. Anyway, I said, "No, sir, just this fence, and you lost, I ain't." He started calling me all kinds of things I couldn't understand, and finally he turned around and got in the car and drove off, and I saw his tag said New Jersey. At that time I said, I had no idea really, I just knew it was way up somewhere to the north, but I decided right there that New Jersey was a bad place. And you know, you never know how fate will work out. A few years later, when I was in the service, one of my best friends was from Toms River, New Jersey. Later in life, I realized that little things like that are really very important learning experiences that make you the person you finally become. More later.